So I'm going to share with you part of my research about the experience of Jhumpa Lahiri, and in particular her case, her first experience with self-translation. Sorry, I can't move the page now. Okay, the overarching research question that this paper aims to answer is, how does a translator's linguistic autobiography elucidate their emotional response to self-translation? Or in other words, how can we read a translator's linguistic autobiography in a way that we can infer useful information about the way they react to the practice of self-translation, to the act of self-translating? And in order to answer this question, I have taken into account several key aspects to one of Lahiri's works, which is called In Altre Parole, or in other words. And these aspects are language learning, in particular, the learning of Italian as a foreign language, and then the practice of exophony, which is closely bound to transfiction, defined as the introduction of translation-related phenomena in fiction, or in Spitzer's words, the aestheticized imagination of translatorial action. And once we have these two pieces put together, then we have a clear picture of how, of what Lahiri's background was when she first encountered self-translation, and why she defined this as a centripetal process. So first things first, who is Jhumpa Lahiri and what kind of text am I looking at? Jhumpa Lahiri can be defined according to Kalman's definition as an ambilingual translingual, meaning that she has two literary languages, basically, so English first and then Italian. And with exophony or translingualism, I'm referring to the practice of writing in a language which is not one's L1, so to say, or primary language, but a language which is adopted at a later stage in one's life. And during this presentation, the term exophony and translingualism really mean the same thing. As we can see here, we have different book covers by Lahiri, and in other words, or in altre parole, was the first book written directly in Italian in 2015, and then translated by Angolzin in 2016. So we have one author and a translator. Whereas what happened some years ago is that Lahiri wrote this other novel, Dove mi trovo, and then translated it herself. So we have one first case of published self-translation. Whereas what she's doing right now is she's using Italian as a language for, so to say, originals or works that come before translation anyway. And the last book is Il quaderno di Nerina, or Nerina's notebook, which is a collection of poems. Let's now focus on in altre parole and the way that self-translation is thematized or represented in this book. So, of course, as you may imagine, Lahiri's experience with self-translation has changed drastically over the last years. But what I'm focusing on today is a first encounter with self-translation, which happened in 2013, when she took part in a literary festival in Capri. The festival was called Le Conversazioni. She participated in this sort of competition with a piece written directly in Italian. So she says an English translation is needed. So the whole presentation today is going to revolve around what happened, or how she reacted to this challenge, if you like, back to 2013. And I want to stress that she does not really give us textual insights about textual criticalities or intricacies that she had to deal with, but rather she thematizes or represents her own emotional reactions to this practice. And with emotional, I mean like feelings, emotion, and observation in general, not just emotion, strictly speaking. Just to give you some context, I want to give some words about what kind of book is In Altre Parole, or in other words. As I was saying, it was the first book that Lahiri wrote directly in Italian, so it's her first exophonic or translingual work. And she defines it as a linguistic autobiography or a linguistic self-portrait. And it is actually a pretty composite or even eclectic work, because it is made up of anecdotes, essays, memories, short stories, and observation and general reflections about Italian as a foreign language or as an adopted language. It is an interesting mixture because it blends fiction and non-fiction, and intermingles reflections about learning a new language with short stories for fiction, for example. The whole book is a sort of channel for discovery, and this sort of discovery takes place at a twofold level. So on the one hand, we have discovery of language, of Italian as a foreign language, but this proceeds alongside a sort of psychological introspection. So we have discovery of the language on the one hand, and discovery of oneself on the other, if you like. This leads us to the last point, which is translation and identity, because self-translation in Lahiri is closely bound to both exophony and to the metaphorical idea of translation, of self-translation as translation of oneself. So the first key aspect to, in other words, is that of learning Italian as a foreign language. This is defined by Lahiri in several ways, but we always have this sort of very emotional ways of putting it. So the first chapter in which she thematizes this aspect is called Love at First Sight in its English translation, where she says, I wouldn't have any real need to learn this language. I only have the desire, but in the end, desire is not but a foolish need. My relationship with Italian takes place in exile. My nostalgia seems nonsensical, still I feel it. So to bring this idea of foolish need and nostalgia close in terms which are closer to scientific discourse, we might define this process as motivated by intrinsic motivation as opposed to external motivation. What I mean by that is that in this case, learning a new language is an activity which is gratifying in itself. It doesn't really depend on or originate from any sort of external needs or compelling necessities in everyday life. So it's something that she enjoys doing and she has a genuine interest in doing so. So that leads her to a stronger motivation. However, in addition to this, there's also an existential component, because Lahiri describes her life as an ongoing clash between true linguistic and existential poles, represented respectively by English as a stepmother or as sort of late language, whereas Bengali, her parents' language, would be the mother language, as her native language. And these two poles have always been engaged in a sort of clash. So that learning Italian would represent a way out of this lifelong clash, really, which is an independent path, both from what happens in Bengali and what happens in English. So we had this sort of very strong motivation, intrinsic motivation, and also nostalgia, because she is learning Italian when she's in the States. And nostalgia, as we know, derives from the incapability to go back to a place where one would like to be. So in this case, to Italy, where Italian would be altre language rather than a foreign language. This leads us to exophony, because all these reflections are taking place in Lahiri's book in Italian, so by means of an adopted language. And the way she represents her own reaction to exophony is not the least straightforward. It's actually pretty much controversial, and even it takes place through opposites. So on the one hand, we have hesitation, an inversion of myself, the feeling of being trapped, the feeling of loss, even demolition and constraint. But on the other, we have this sort of persistent impulse to write and learn Italian, which represent an enticing path, something which stirs our own motivation, as I was saying. And also this leads to a process through which she feels renewed. She experiences a sort of salvation from creative stagnation in a way that she can reconstruct herself, and she feels free through the means offered by a new language. I would say that these all takes place through dialectical dynamics. And what I mean by that is a sort of three major phases, a negative one, a positive one, and then an empowerment status. Because the first one would be a spaccatura, so a break, which then leads to nascita, so birth. And the final state of this will be retrieving a new voice, so a nuova voce, which is represented by exophony. And it is interesting to notice how exophony, in other words, is strictly bound to transfiction. And transfiction has two main roles here. So in the first place, it is the first nucleus of Exophony. The first thing that Lahiri writes and publishes in Italian is a piece of transfiction, so a story, a fictionalized story of a translator. But it also is a way to move from a sort of diaristic writing, a sort of fragmented and private writing, to something which is a short story and was actually published. Through transfiction, many of the dynamics and Lahiri experiences are amplified. And I have two examples here. So the first one is writing is my only way to absorb life and give it an order. And the second is writing is a prolonged praise of imperfection. And these are two aspects which we can retrieve in the short story called Lo Scambio, the exchange, the protagonist of which is a woman, a translator, who considered herself imperfect. She wanted to generate another version of herself in the same way she could turn a text from one language into another. So as it's clear, transfiction is a way to amplify dynamics related to what writing means in her own experiences, but also this feeling of being an imperfect individual, imperfect writer, which in this short chapter are amplified. And also a pivotal role in this short story is played by a black jumper, which symbolizes language and is something that she thinks she has lost, but then eventually retrieves. So the lost component to it would be having lost authority. So having refused to use English, which is the language in which she felt comfortable in the first place, to move to Italian. So that's why when she retrieves this black jumper, it feels so unfamiliar to her. So it's just a symbol that represents, so to say, an old and a new language. This leads us, so we have a strong intrinsic motivation and the feeling of being renewed through this new language, which are the two findings of the first two sections, which leads us to analyzing self-translation and to understand why she defines that as a centripetal process. So she participates in the literary festival Le Conversazioni with a piece written in Italian, so that an English translation was needed. What she says in this respect is, I'd be the natural translator, but I don't have the least will. This idea of natural translator is possibly very much entrenched in, or has been so far in translation studies, because it is redolent of so much prescriptivism in the disciplines, if one thinks about Newmark, among many others. But it's also been analyzed by other scholars. For instance, Kellman points out how self-translation is often seen as an agony that many translingual writers would forego. And in Grutman's analysis of In Altre Parole, he points out how this practice would be time-consuming and stresses the fact that it is often related to the refusal of self-translation, is often related to a matter of linguistic skills. However, if we consider that behind the choice of Italian, there's a strong motivation for as language learning, and there's a sense of renewal, then probably this time-consuming and matter of linguistic skills are two pretty much superficial reasons to avoid it. Lahiri has a very wide imagery behind the self-translation practice. In these two instances, we have maternal metaphor, according to which she is the mother of two sons, the two sons being respectively English as a budding adolescent and Italian as a newborn baby. And what she does is, I want to defend my Italian, which I hold as a newborn. This is one of the metaphors. The other one is that of an attack, because the English translation, she says, divorce the Italian text in a way that it makes it more explicit, but also more dull. And eventually, this leads her to define self-translation as defeat, as regression, and even as suicide, where this climax here, which really explains how she didn't have the least desire to produce the English translation of her Italian piece herself. And this is how she comes to define self-translation as a centripetal process, which does not involve any mystery, any discovery, and any encounter with anything which is outside myself, which actually leads us to problematize the very etymology of translation and something as a process which brings a text forward. Because if self-translation is a centripetal process, which is the center and which is the origin, self-translating in this first experience of Lahiri is something that bounds back to an origin, and the origin is English, which, as Grootman was pointing out, is a center which maybe might feel as something which is more reassuring on the one hand, but on the other is oppressing, and she was deliberately trying to avoid it, to refuse it, in order to achieve a new dimension, both at the level of creativity and at the level of identity-related questions. So we have this idea of oppressing center, and then we have the idea of nostalgia, which, as I was saying, is nostalgia for a new dimension. So it's nostalgia towards something that she is longing for, which is the mastering of Italian as a literary language, which, as we have seen in the beginning of this presentation, has become a thing because her last books have been published in Italian. So what Grootman says in this respect is that self-translation can represent a re-territorializing gesture, as I was saying, because it brings back the author or the translator to the sphere of English, which is something that she was deliberately avoiding. So I'm coming to the conclusion of this paper, and I think that this has allowed us to achieve a clear picture of the author's background when it comes to her first experience of self-translation. We have these three main points here, which correspond to the three key aspects I have analyzed. So the first one is intrinsic motivation behind language learning, accompanied by a feeling of nostalgia for a new language, a longing for mastering this new language. And then we have exophony as a way out of an existential conundrum of this lifelong clash between English and Bengali, amplified in transfiction, amplified through exophony, because, as she was saying, writing is a praise for imperfection, both creatively and at the level of identity. And eventually, we are this sort of creative regeneration. So once we consider these 3 points, it makes sense to see why she defined her first encounter with self-translation as in pretty much negative terms, as centripetal process, but also through the climax I was mentioning, as a regression, as something that does not lead to any further development, but rather as a suicide, because it happens in a stage of her life where she needs consolidation of the new language and still had not achieved this sort of empowerment status, if you like. This answers the overarching research question, but also leads us to open new possibilities. For instance, this approach is a more personalized or humanized approach to the study of a translator's autobiography, of linguistic autobiography, as she says, because there is so much more than just text. There are translators with their own emotions and feelings, not only behind the text as agents behind the text, but also we are seen inside the text as fictional or semi-fictional characters. And hopefully this sort of study will be the possible basis for comparison with other translators' experiences. However, there are also limits. So the first one, as I was saying, is that a translator's attitude may very well change over the years. And it was in fact the case of Lahiri as well. I highlighted how this analysis was focused on her own first encounter with self-translation, but not so many years ago, she took a completely different direction as she self-translated her own Dove mi trovo in whereabouts, whereas her own reason for having Goldstein translating in altre parole, as in other words, was that if she had to self-translate, in other words, into English herself, she would have been tempted to not preserve those rough edges, almost verbatim, that she had created in the source text, if you like. The other limit is that these sort of findings might be highly specific to one translator, in this case, in Lahiri's case, and they don't allow for so much generalizability. Although possibly this sort of approach, which considers several key components to a translator's linguistic autobiography, might represent some sort of example or the basis for future comparisons. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this fascinating example of an autobiographical text. And I'm just looking through the chat if there are questions. Yes.
Of course. So there's a comment here from the boardroom.
Good.
I just wanted to comment on when you talked about metaphor of her struggle between Bengali and English, and then Italian being a third way. This reminds me of Yoko Tawada's text and her metaphor of the Sprachmutter. You know, so in a way, in another parole, you can see that Lahiri has several Sprachmutter that she finds in her journey learning Italian, like the friends who present her with dictionaries or like who help her navigate the Italian language. So just wanted to make that connection. And also one thing I wanted to point out, and you probably know that, but Anne Goldstein, she works with a New Yorker, and she translated Elena Zamenta as well. So it does help that, again, going back to the celebrity translator thing, that her the translator who translated her this book of essays by her is a very well-known name, and it helps bring it forward. But also at the same time, Lahiri herself was very famous, not very good, but she had a career writing in English, but she was seen as like a Bengali American author, and if you see her books in English, they're mostly thematizing that, and then whereas in Italian she can have a new identity in a way. So I don't know why I want to just to bring the consecrating aspect of it, like she's already a consecrated author who then steps into another language. It helps a lot having that, and then also having her translator be a very famous person. But and it would be interesting to maybe compare Jhumpa Lahiri's translation or her if she writes about that new translation she did versus Anne Goldstein's vision of that same process. So they can the same author, even though the text is different.
Yeah, that would be
it's not a question, it's just
a comment. Thanks very much. Yeah, actually, they are not just mother tongues in altre parole, because the first, say, mother tongue would be Bengali, because that's the origin language, her family's language, which sort of survives in the spoken dimension. But then English represents what she calls a stepmother, so a Stiefmutter rather than a Sprachmutter, because it came later at a later stage. Although she was born in London and raised in the US, in Rhode Island, but the language spoken at home would be Bengali, and the language of education and everyday life would be English. So, and then we have Italian, of course, which is just an adopted language, as Cameron says. And yeah, the book is full of metaphors. In particular, when she tries to define language, she tends towards spatial metaphors. Whereas when she describes self-translation, then spatial metaphors paved the way for this maternal image of having two sons, English as a annoying or bullying adolescent, and Italian as a newborn, a vulnerable baby which she's trying to protect. So, and yeah, to go back to Anne Goldstein, she's becoming another celebrity translator, to go back to the previous presentation. She gave her own voice to Elena Ferrante, indeed. Yeah, she's another star translator, sorry. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Was she already an adult when she came into Italian?
Yeah, so she first encountered Italian for her doctoral dissertation, actually, although very marginally. And then she had a trip to Italy, and she said she fell in love with the language, and that's how it all began. So this romance in there as well, which is good.
Okay, are there other questions in the audience or in the chat? Otherwise, I would like just to make a brief remark, because at the end you seem to be a bit doubtful about the validity of your research, because the case of Lahiri might be limited to a very specific case. I think that's exactly the value of such, because it shows us a new aspect of, in this case, self-translation. And I think it's exactly that what we should look for. Those special cases which broaden our vision of, in this case, self-translation or transfiction or emotional response to translation. So I think it's a really fascinating and very precious case for our discipline.
Thanks for this comment. Yeah, hopefully that will be the case.
Okay.